How you going, people? It is April 9th, the day of the trial of George Floyd, and they're doing something off the record. Let's listen what they're doing, and then we'll see if you guys catch this.
And we're going to deal with that off audio and off video, but it will be on the record, and the press can remain and report on what is going on in the courtroom, but it will not be broadcast outside this room. So if you could get the juror for us.
Okay, so what are they doing off the record? Somebody has made a jury misconduct or something, and they're getting one of the jurors to discuss what she said, what she did, what somebody heard her say, who somebody saw her talking to, whether an attorney talked to her, whether another jury did something they weren't supposed to. So they're investigating something with the juries to see which juror did something wrong or is reporting something. And the reason they don't want it on camera audio is they don't want us knowing who the jury is, or the juror is. So they're going to allow the reporters to report on it, but we can't hear the audio. So that's what they're dealing with. And when they call the next witness, I'll restart it. And while we're waiting, we're going to go over Mr. Truman H.W. I haven't seen him commenting before. He's a new commenter. But I like his comments because he is very explanatory. He knows how to use paragraphs so you can read it, whereas other people write 17, 19, 25 lines and they don't do a paragraph, so it's very hard to read. And I pegged one of his comments because he explains the difference between amphetamine and methamphetamine very well. Let me get to that. Response status. I responded. Let's see if he gives me this. So here's his very well explained. All the methyl, is that methanol or methyl? Methanol. No, there's no AL. I'll just call it methyl. Groups is increase the half-life because the liver can't break down, metabolize is the same word for breakdown, methylated amphetamine. So methamphetamine, and I didn't know this, and man, I worked with methamphetamine a long time, so that's why I like a good educated audience, because then I don't waste my time reading shit that doesn't help me. This is great. So I didn't know that amphetamine, if you add methylated or whatever they add to it, to methyl group, I guess methylated is part of methyl group, if you add it to amphetamine, it makes it methamphetamine, and it increases the half-life. And half-life of a drug is normally how long you get the high. So, you smoke weed. If it's good weed, you may get a buzz, and I'm just making this up. You may get a buzz for an hour. If it's really, really great weed, you may get 2 hours. So some weed is better than other weed. Some methamphetamine is better than other methamphetamine. But I didn't know that it doesn't say it doubles. He says it increases the half-life. So basically methamphetamine just increases the power of amphetamine, which is pretty good. Amphetamine is the exact same thing. So to say that it's not an intoxicant, I didn't hear him say amphetamine wasn't an intoxicant. I did hear the defense kind of argue with him that amphetamine is like non-fentanyl, which he explains here. I did hear that, and I went, I'm not sure if amphetamine is the same as non-fentanyl. In the back of my mind, something kind of triggered, but I went, oh, maybe it is. I just never really researched it or knew it. But this guy's explaining it well, that amphetamine and methamphetamine are both intoxicants. So unlike fentanyl, once your body produces it, it produces non-fentanyl. But I think he's saying it's the same thing too. Hang on. Let's see. Intoxicant, unless he had enough of either to mislead the court or jury, be poor understanding of the required explanation and mildly autistic. Defense is thinking the same thing as fentanyl and non-fentanyl. Equally misunderstands the norfentanyl is insert, but it's not. You need to add the effects of those to calculate their potency, and would need to use an opiate calculator. I didn't know they made an opiate calculator to evaluate relative intensities per mg or ng. Okay, remember, testosterone actually undergoes a 5-AR enzyme and becomes estrogen. Didn't know that. As well as DHT in men. And in women, estrogen breaks down via the same exact enzyme, the 5-AR, into testosterone. Didn't know that. So this is why this guy gives me credibility. I mean, he could be making all this up. I mean, I don't know. This guy could be Ray Charles in disguise. But some of the things he's saying I know is correct. So therefore I believe the other things he's saying he knows what he's talking about. Plus he's using technical terms and explaining it in a way that demonstrates he kind of knows what the hell he's talking about. Remember, testosterone undergoes an alpha. Okay, I don't really want to know. The metabolizes. But the fact that the attorney doesn't know that amphetamines are an active drug in humans is kind of lived under a rock in some respect. Well, a lot of people that aren't, I mean, attorneys that don't do a lot of drug cases don't do this. And you may get a drug attorney, and normally they will call in an expert. And sometimes they listen to their testimony, and sometimes they learn, and sometimes they don't. You know, when I was a DRE and I knew all my drugs, I was a lot better at explaining this because I was dealing with it every day. I was researching. When I came up with problems, it made me research it. Therefore, it confirmed what I was thinking and what I knew. So when I was actively working as a drug recognition expert, I was much more competent than I am now because I've been out of it a while. I mean, I retain some things, but you just lose it. It's almost like muscle memory. If you don't do a task over and over and you don't do it a long time, you have to relearn it a little bit. So, and I'm not defending the attorney, but there's a lot of things that he had to become an expert on overnight because most attorneys who aren't cops, they have to learn about reasonableness, use of force, all the different uses of force that we use, the escalation, everything, evaluating officer safety, and they're not used to that. So he's learning a lot of different things in order to try and convince the jury, you know, to look at it. But anyway, I thought his comment was great. I end up pinning it. So this thing is pinned on this video. So, and now we're waiting for the trial to start. But I appreciate, you know, the good comments to where, and I mean, all these, I'm getting a lot of great comments on here. I just really liked his explanation of that on the drugs. So, a lot of people keep telling me about Crowder doing the thing, and evidently they didn't see the video I did on that where I mentioned that, because YouTube, like I said, I think they give out notifications 1 every 4 videos I give. God forbid that somebody speaking opposite of the left-wing liberal agenda would get publicity. All right, 7 minutes. Holy shit. All right, we'll end that there until the trial starts. Okay, so this is a pathologist. Let's see what she has to say.
Medicine and law overlap. So it could be any.
You raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do, yes.
And Dr. Thomas, if you feel comfortable doing so, we'd ask you to remove your mask. I will keep mine on.
I would love that. Thank you.
And let's begin by having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Lindsey.
It almost looks like she's reading her name. I mean, she hasn't even started to testify, and she's got to refer to her notes to spell her name? Really?
Lindsey, Carol, Carol, Thomas, Thomas.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Thomas.
Good morning.
Wasn't there a movie about somebody who was written up for too much excited happiness or something? There was, I can't remember. Maybe somebody remember it. I thought there was something where a guy got an evaluation. He was too happy. Or
Would you please tell us what kind of a doctor you are?
I'm a forensic pathologist.
And what is a forensic pathologist?
Forensic pathology is that branch of pathology, which is a branch of medicine, where medicine and law overlap. So it could be anything with a medical and legal component. It could be toxicology. In some cases, it may involve living patients, but as I practice, and as most forensic pathologists practice, it involves what's called medico-legal death investigation.
Does it involve taking care of patients in the clinical sense?
Not living patients, no. A forensic pathologist may be consulted to help with the evaluation and interpretation of injuries in a living patient, but not in a treatment or clinical sense.
So most of your work then is done on deceased people?
Correct.
Any specific types of deaths?
Yes, the state statutes lists the types of deaths that have to be reported to the medical examiner, and briefly they tend to be unnatural deaths, so accidents, suicides, homicides, unexpected deaths, potentially suspicious deaths, that type of category of death.
Do you get special training in how to determine the cause and manner of death?
Yes.
Tell us something about the special training you received.
Well,
Did I miss where she works or who she works for? Did they pay her to come in, or is she hired by the state?
I start back in medical school or just just the end part?
Just the end part.
Okay. I did a fellowship in forensic pathology, which is a specified training program for legal death investigations and certify cause and manner of death.
So would you tell us what pathology is as a field of medicine?
Sure. Pathologists are sometimes considered the doctor's doctor because we don't directly treat patients, but we provide information to doctors who then do treat patients. So, for example, if you've ever been to a lab and had blood drawn, that goes to a laboratory that is run by a pathologist, a clinical pathologist. So, blood count, chemistries, things like that. Or if you've ever known someone that had a biopsy and was diagnosed with cancer, that's the type of pathology that is done by an anatomic pathologist. So you look at tissue and under the microscope and make diagnoses.
Is a medical examiner a forensic pathologist?
In Minnesota, a medical examiner is a forensic pathologist who is appointed by the County Board of Commissioners to be that county's medical examiner.
So it's a public official?
Yes.
So when you talk about the medical legal investigations, is that sort of a fancy way of describing what forensic pathologists do?
Yes, it's what the medical examiner's office does. It's death investigations, again, where there is a medical component and there may be a legal component.
Is it different from, say, a death in a hospital?
Yes, so if someone dies in a hospital, those are usually deaths due to natural causes. And they may have a medical death investigation in the sense that a hospital pathologist might do an autopsy, but they wouldn't do the full scope of the medical legal death investigation because those are mostly due to natural diseases.
What does death investigation entail?
Well, the way a medical examiner's office performs a death investigation, I think a lot of people assume it's all about the autopsy, the physical examination of the body, and that's really just a tiny part of the death investigation. The death investigation really starts at the very beginning when a death is found, a person is found deceased, or the office is notified of the death. We, as medical examiners, want to know all about that person. What's their past medical history, social history, family history. So we will do whatever we need to do to get that kind of history. Then we want to know, well, what happened, what were their terminal events? What happened around the time of their death? Were they complaining of something? Were they interacting with someone? Were they driving? Were they using machinery, something like that? And then we'll look at the physical examination, and that part of the exam might include x-rays. It could include getting specimens for toxicology, for cultures, for all kinds of other laboratory tests, including looking at things under the microscope, little sections of each organ under the microscope. So that's the physical exam part. Then we'll look at the laboratory results. So that would be usually toxicology, but as I say, it could be blood cultures, or more recently, it's probably been a lot of COVID testing, that kind of thing. And then look at the microscopic slides, and then put all of that together with the history, the terminal events, the physical findings.
So far, I think she's doing pretty good. She's explained things. She's articulate. And again, there's no bias here because she's just kind of explaining her career field. Again, building her expertise in front of the jury. You want the jury to believe the person and think the person knows what they're talking about. So this is where they kind of hook you in. The problem is, if they hook you in here and then they start testifying like some of these other doctors with all this great resume, and that woman that left a pill in the car, didn't even search her car right, she had all these degrees and sold herself as this great outstanding person, then her testimony and her actions were absolutely horrible. So this part is always kind of like, yeah, we get it. Okay, you know what you're talking about. Let's get to meat and potatoes.
The laboratory findings, and then that's how the medical examiner reaches a conclusion about the cause and manner of death.
So all of that goes into a death investigation.
Yes.
Do you sometimes interview people also as a part of it?
Yes, the investigators who go to the scene may talk to family members. We certainly will talk to medical providers to get someone's past medical history. We often will interview or talk with law enforcement officers if they were the people who responded. It could be paramedics, EMS, troopers, just depends on the case.
I want to ask you about a phrase used, terminal events.
Yes.
Could you explain to the jury what is a terminal event?
Sure. So when we're investigating a death as medical examiners, as I mentioned, we want to know as much as we can about this person leading up to their death, because that often, how they lived, will provide us information about how they died. When I'm talking about terminal events, I'm talking about what happened.
How they lived is how they died. Let's see. He had that sabozanone in his system, that opiates, that treats opiate addiction. He had marijuana, he had methamphetamine, he had fentanyl, he had nicotine, and he had caffeine. He had a 90% blockage. He was COVID positive. He was fighting, he was eating drugs, and he had high blood pressure, and he smokes, and he had a tumor.
Happened in the period of time around their deaths, shortly leading up to their death. So, for example, he was out shoveling snow, he came in, clutched his chest, and fell over. That would be an example of a terminal event. Or we know someone was driving a car and went off the road. That would be what the terminal events were.
Do you also rely on training and expertise on how injuries occur?
Yes, as a forensic pathologist, that's one of the things we look at is...
Remember, this is the prosecution's witness. So it's probably going to be, she's going to be saying what she was told or helps the prosecution. But we'll see. I mean, so far she seems okay.
And learn about is when we see this type of injury, we associate that with this type of event.
What does the medical examiner then do at the conclusion of a death investigation?
So the ultimate goal is to complete the information that's needed on the death certificate, specifically the cause and manner of death.
Is a report generated?
Yes.
What's the nature of that report?
Well, one of the main reports that's generated would be considered the autopsy report, and that's the report of the physical examination. But ultimately, the death certificate is kind of the final report.
Now, you told us as a forensic pathologist, you don't treat living patients.
Right.
So if we wanted to have a discussion, for example, about measuring lung volumes or air reserves in someone, that wouldn't be your bailiwick as a medical examiner?
That would not be me, no. By the time I see them, none of that applies, yes.
Right. So Dr. Thomas, are you currently employed?
I work, I'm kind of semi-retired. I do consulting, and then I work part-time at medical examiners' offices in Reno, Nevada, and Salt Lake City, Utah.
Reno and Salt Lake City, Dr. Thomas?
They're places, I really like the way the office runs, and I like still to be involved as a medical examiner.
In pretty good places.
So you don't use your medical examiner from your city and county that you're prosecuting. That should be a red flag. Why are we hearing from a medical examiner completely out of our area? Is our medical examiner incompetent? Or did the prosecution not like the results, so he found somebody who would tell him the results he liked? Those are all questions that jurors should have. But again, you don't get on a jury by being smart or passing an intelligence test.
To hike.
And good places to hike, yes.
So where did you do your work before you were semi-retired?
Right before I retired, I was at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office as an assistant medical examiner. And do you want me to go before that?
Yes, if you could tell us your work experience as a medical examiner forensic pathologist.
Sure. Initially, I started after my training at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office, working as a deputy and assistant, then assistant medical examiner, and I was there for many years. And then in 1997, I joined the Minnesota Regional Medical Examiner's Office that was based in Hastings. And then I was chief of that office for 13 years. And we were the medical examiner's office for 8 counties in Minnesota, the largest of which were Dakota and Scott counties. And we also served as an autopsy referral service and medical examiner's office for many other counties in Minnesota, as well as Wisconsin and even one in Michigan. And then when our office outgrew that space, Dakota and Scott counties merged with Hennepin County, and that's why then I came back to Hennepin County.
Okay, so she kind of cleared that up a little bit. I was saying, why were they searching for her out? But it looks like she's got experience in the area, so I take back my previous kind of criticism. Or, again, I just had a question, and now she cleared it up.
For how many years have you performed work or services as a forensic pathologist?
Let's see, 37 now, 36.
And in Minnesota, how many counties?
Oh, gosh. Well, I've been the direct medical examiner for 8 counties. I've worked in offices that have been consultant to dozens of other counties.
And have you also performed those services in parts of Wisconsin?
Yes.
When did you stop working at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office?
It was early 2017. I retired from Hennepin County.
And how many autopsies would you estimate you have performed over your career?
Probably about 5,000 that I myself did, and then hundreds, maybe 1,000 more where I assisted someone else, or I supervised, or I participated in some way.
So in 5,000 or so cases, you've determined the cause and manner of death?
Well, actually way more than that, because as medical examiners, we don't just certify the cause and manner of death for the cases that we do autopsies on. There are numerous other cases that get reported by law to the medical examiner's office where we don't do a physical examination. So, for example, an elderly person falls in a nursing home and gets a hip fracture and then dies a couple months later. That death has to be reported to the medical examiner's office. We will investigate that death by looking at the medical records and doing all of what I talked about, getting family input and medical provider input, but we generally will not do a physical examination, but still, by law, we have to sign the death certificate.
So you're still determining then the cause and manner of death?
Right, we're just not using a physical examination as part of it.
And using the medical records primarily?
Yes.
Dr. Thomas, are you licensed presently?
Yes, I'm licensed in Minnesota,
All right,
Wisconsin, Tennessee,
Let's
Nevada,
go.
and certified American pathologists, specifically forensic pathologists. Yes.
Tell us about
I have been a clinical instructor here at the University of School and College.
Do you have any publications?
And early
Wanted
on,
a book deal.
examining did some questions. Well, the Hennepin County Medical, as well as Health Partners medical records. Then I looked at a lot of interviews,
Oh, she's
many
reading.
videos, and Mr.
He must ask her a question about.
conclusion about what I thought the cause and manner of death were and the mechanism for that cause.
Could you give the jurors a general sense or overview of the kinds of materials you reviewed?
May I look at my notes?
Yes, if you need to refresh your recollection.
You can look and refresh. You can't read from your notes.
So I looked at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner materials, including the autopsy report and toxicology and photographs and microscopic slides, things like that.
When a witness brings notes up to the stand and uses them, the defense is allowed to get copies of those notes. So you have to be careful. They always tell cops, don't write something on there that you don't want the defense to see, because he can get a copy. If you use them, they get a copy.
Like that. I looked at the Hennepin County Medical Center records, so Mr. Floyd's past medical history from there, as well as Health Partners medical records. Then I looked at a lot of interviews, many videos, including body-worn camera videos, bystander videos, surveillance videos, some photographs, still photographs, timeline, and then some medical literature and textbooks.
So were you the medical examiner who investigated or did the autopsy around the death of George Floyd?
No, that was the Dr. Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County Medical Examiner.
Do you know Dr. Baker?
I do. He was a pathology resident when I was on staff at Hennepin County many years ago. And then when he did his fellowship, I was one of the staff people there. And then after our offices merged, I worked again with him at Hennepin County.
So would you have been then part of his training in his early formative years?
Yes.
Do you consider him a friend?
I do, yes.
Have you talked to him about this case?
No, not since right after it happened.
But you did review his report,
Yes.
and as well as Mr. Floyd's medical records?
Uh-oh. Because he's asking her if she likes him and they work together and he was her supervisor, I'm pretty sure she's going to disagree with his findings. But we'll see.
Yes.
Did you review the history of terminal events for May 25th, 2020?
Yes.
So
And what was kind of unique, what was absolutely unique in this case was the volume of materials I had to review. I've never had a case like this that had such thorough documentation of the term.
This is a very important case. A felon was out there committing felony crimes, fighting with the cops, and died. I mean, this is like the most important case in the world right now. That's why there's so much information. 200 FBI agents, 400 state agents, you know, millions of dollars, because this is the case.
Terminal events.
And by way of the thorough documentation, what makes it so thorough, in your opinion?
Well, the use of videos is unique in this case. Certainly, as medical examiners, we use videos, but there's never been a case that I've been involved with that had videos over such a long time frame and from so many different perspectives.
Are you aware then of Dr. Baker's conclusions then on the manner of death?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to show Exhibit 193 that's been stipulated to subject to Dr. Baker's foundation. Dr. Thomas, what do we see here on Exhibit 193?
This is a copy of the certificate of death of Mr. Floyd.
Okay. And so, Brett, if we could kind of highlight just through the word underlying, just to make it a little bigger to see. Okay. Based on your review of the evidence and the death certificate, do you agree with Dr. Baker's determination on the cause of death?
Yes, I do.
And is that by the word immediate on here?
Yes, cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression.
Have you, Dr. Thomas, formed an opinion about the mechanism of death?
Yes.
Would you tell us what that is?
In this case, I believe the primary mechanism of death is asphyxia or low oxygen.
So we'll come back to the mechanism in just a minute. Can you explain to the jury what this cause of death means and why you agree with it?
Well, it's kind of in two parts. So there's the cardiopulmonary arrest, which it doesn't provide a lot of additional clarifying information because, in a way, everyone dies of when your heart stops and your lungs stop. That's cardiopulmonary arrest. But as a forensic pathologist, I would use cardiopulmonary arrest when to differentiate it from a cardiac arrest. So this is not a sudden cardiac death, a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. This is a death where both the heart and lungs stopped working. And the point is that it's due to law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and compression. That is kind of what ultimately is the immediate cause of death, is the subdual, restraint, and compression.
Wow.
And just so it's clear for the jurors.
Wow, she just threw the cops under the bus. They caused his heart to stop. It wasn't the drugs. It wasn't the meth, the fentanyl, the nicotine, the caffeine, the Suboxone, whatever, the opiate, the tumor. It wasn't because he was a smoker. It wasn't because he had high blood pressure. It wasn't because he had a 90% blockage and he was eating drugs at the time. And he was COVID positive. And he was fighting the cops. No. It wasn't any of that. It was the law enforcement that did it. Wow.
Does cardiopulmonary arrest mean heart attack?
No.
Does it mean fatal arrhythmia as a primary cause of death?
No.
It simply means that the heart stops and the lungs have stopped.
Correct.
It's another way of simply describing death itself.
Right.
Can you explain what's referred to, looking here at the terms, subdual, restraint, and neck compression?
Those were activities by the law enforcement agency officers involved. Subdual is subduing someone. Trying to restrain them is, in Mr. Floyd's case, involved handcuffing him, his positioning on the ground, the prone position, the people kneeling on him. And the neck compression is the knee on the neck specifically. Additionally, there was some back and other things being compressed by the officers.
So if you put all this together, cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating, law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression, what does that mean?
Well, what it means to me is that the activities of the law enforcement officers resulted in Mr. Floyd's death, and that specifically those activities were the subdual, the restraint, and the neck compression.
I wonder how many people are restrained and handcuffed a day in America and don't die. and fight with the cops. Maybe because they're not on fentanyl, method. I mean, it's just crazy the way all these doctors are just totally ignoring. Now, if they would have put the cause of death as a cardiac arrest or whatever they put, complicated by Mr. Floyd's fighting with law enforcement restraining him, health issues with Mr. Floyd, and drugs, I would have been okay with that cause of death. But to only put the heart and the cops as the cause of death, and again, if this was really scientific, to me, you wouldn't need a video. If you can't tell me what happened without a video, because a video fills in your confirmation bias. If I think you died of a heart attack, but then I see that somebody strangled you, then I'm not going to put you died of a heart attack. I'm going to change my mind because I saw something else. Why don't you give me a forensic exam of the body and tell me what you found without seeing the video and using video and other people's input? But that's just me, my opinion.
And does this then also represent your own conclusion?
Yes.
A conclusion you have reached and an opinion you hold to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
Would you tell us what you reviewed in order to reach this conclusion?
All of those things that I mentioned earlier, again, what's sort of unique about this case is that often I would just review the medical examiner case file, and that would provide information about what the cause and manner of death is. But in this case,
which I think would be more accurate and fair. In this case, because of the publicity, because of the color, because nobody wants to see the city burn down, and everybody has a vested interest to stop burn, loot, murder from happening, they all want to come to the same conclusion. This is so biased and unfair.
Autopsy itself didn't tell me the cause and manner of death, and it really required getting all of this other additional information, specifically the video evidence of the terminal events, to conclude the cause of death and manner of death.
When you make reference to something called the mechanism of death,
Yeah.
would you tell us what mechanism of death means?
So, cause of death is what's the thing, the disease or the injury or the process that caused someone's death. But the mechanism is kind of what was going on in the body at that time. So, for example, the cause of death might be a gunshot wound, but the mechanism of death might be blood loss related to that gunshot wound, or an infection that complicated that gunshot wound down the road.
Or drugs that complicated the restraint of the officers. Notice she's not giving that example. Amount of drugs and pre-existing health conditions. Because if a gunshot can cause blood loss, why can't drugs cause heart problems?
Something like that. So it's more what was actually happening at the body level that resulted in the cause of death.
So focusing in on the mechanism of death here, how is it that the officers with dual restraint and neck compression caused Mr. Floyd's death?
So as I mentioned, I think the primary mechanism was asphyxia or low oxygen. And it basically is Mr. Floyd was in a position because of the subdual restraint and compression where he was unable to get enough oxygen in to maintain his body functions.
What's required for normal breathing, Dr. Thomas?
What is required?
Yeah.
Well, there are kind of three components. You have to be able to get air in, so you have to have what's called a patent airway.
So remember, she's covering all this. The defense has no clue. So he's over there rapidly writing and trying to listen to her and write questions to where he got it wrong. So when she says something, imagine trying to write down your question and response and what she got wrong and still listen to her so you don't miss something that she says next and you miss that and you can't question her about it. Again, the defense is always on the downside of the stacking of the deck. And some people explain it as the government is the house always wins. And that's a fine explanation for people that play poker or gamble. The house always wins. The odds are always with the house. The odds are always with government. They get all the decks. They get to meet with their witness several times before they testify. So they built a camaraderie. They built a relationship. They learn to trust. They feel comfortable with that person that's questioning them because they've met him 6 or 7 times and been questioned by him. So there's already this division. And again, when the defense pulls his case, the prosecution necessarily doesn't get to talk to his witnesses. They don't talk to him. He gets to meet with them. So his direct examination of his witnesses is going to be biased to the defense, and the defense or the prosecution, and the prosecution will be playing catch up like the defense is. But the biggest advantage is the prosecution gets to go first because they get to put on their case to prosecute the person. They get first crack at the jury. They get to sit next to the jury. They get all the friendly witnesses. They get all the government witnesses. They don't have to pay for anything themselves. All their decisions are based on taxpayer money, so it doesn't matter. The defense, on the other hand, normally has a whole bunch of factors they have to consider about defending their client.
And that could be nose, mouth, soft tissues of the neck, the larynx, the trachea, the larynx, trachea, bronchi, all of that has to be open. At the level of the lungs itself, there has to be adequate air exchange between oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide going out. And then finally, the way the lungs work is it's kind of like a bellows, that when you suck in air, your diaphragm drops and pulls air in, and then when you relax, the diaphragm collapses and pushes air out. So all three of those things have to be functioning in order to get adequate oxygen in. So, for example, if someone is smothered or strangled, or they inhale a piece of hot dog, or they have pneumonia such that their lungs are completely filled, then their airway is obstructed so that there isn't adequate air coming in, oxygen coming in. Or if someone is in an environment where there isn't enough oxygen, so for example, in a closed garage in which an old car has been running, there may be way high carbon monoxide, and in that case, they're perfectly able to breathe in and out, but there just isn't enough oxygen. And then the third would be if there's some kind of restriction such that your chest can't expand, your diaphragm can't expand, so the bellows function isn't working. And if any one of those components isn't working, then the result will be this mechanism of inadequate oxygen.
Doctor, how does narrowing of the hypopharynx fit into this?
Well, the example I would give that people are probably most familiar with is sleep apnea or snoring. If you yourself or have a partner who snores, you know that especially in certain positions, what happens is the hypopharynx, which is sort of the soft tissues at the back of your throat, will kind of collapse because there's inadequate air coming, either forcing it out or forcing it in, which is why a CPAP machine works, because it forces air through that floppy area. And if that collapses, then it makes it difficult to get air in.
So, Dr. Thomas, what do you rely on to reach your conclusion that low oxygen was the mechanism of death?
In this case, it was primarily the evidence from the terminal events, the video evidence, that show Mr. Floyd in a position where he was...
So without the video, what would you have diagnosed the death? I would ask that.
Unable to adequately breathe.
So how does the autopsy report itself assist you or not?
So the way the autopsy really helps is it's great for ruling things out. So in this case, the autopsy ruled out, for example, underlying lung disease. Mr. Floyd had had a history of COVID, but there was no evidence in his lungs at the time of his death that he had any lung disease that would impair his ability to breathe. And it ruled out injuries to the neck that suggest that the bones in his neck had been broken, for example. And it ruled out a stroke. He didn't have a stroke, so it wasn't like his blood pressure was so high that, he ruptured a vessel in his brain. He didn't have an aneurysm. He didn't have, which is a ruptured vessel. He didn't have an embolism, which is a blood clot. He didn't rupture his heart. He didn't have an old heart attack or a recent heart attack or what's called myocardial infarct. So the autopsy is really great for ruling things out.
Dr. Thomas, just to focus on one of those, you said the autopsy ruled out a recent myocardial infarction.
Yes.
How does it do that?
Well, when a forensic pathologist examines a heart, one of the things they look at is the coronary arteries, which are the vessels that supply blood and nutrients to the heart muscle.
I want to bring out another example of how the prosecution gets advantage. You notice they have different prosecutors. That means those prosecutors only have to learn one part of the case. This guy had to learn about this witness. Another attorney had to learn about another witness. Another attorney may do the drugs. Another attorney may do the police stuff. Another attorney. So there's not this massive, I've got to become an expert on everything, which is the opposite for the defense. He's got one guy. He's got to become an expert on everything about this trial because he's the only guy, which is why he's going hoarse. But that's just part of it, I guess.
And then the pathologist will examine the muscle of the heart. And if someone has had a recent heart attack, there may be evidence in the heart muscle of that
Maybe evidence, not will be.
damage. Or if they've had a prior and older heart attack, there will be scarring in the heart muscle that shows that area of damage.
Thank you, doctor. Is it normal as a part of your death investigation then to seek out and to look at the video?
Yes. Oh, yes.
In this case, is there any particular video footage that struck you as more significant than others from what you saw?
Oh, gosh, this case, there were so many. The body-worn camera videos were very instructive because they started, well, and the cup foods video because they showed how Mr. Floyd was behaving long before law enforcement interaction. Then the body-worn cameras show the early interactions before there was any of this subdual restraint and compression. And then they show the interactions during the subdual restraint. The bystander videos are really instructive, as well as the surveillance videos from the scene at showing kind of during the time of the restraint. So there were lots, I would say.
So in terms of the video footage then either ruling in a cause or ruling out a cause, how did it inform your assessments about the cause of death, having looked at the video?
Well, it helped me rule in a cause and also rule out causes, I would say.
So did it help you determine whether this was what I might refer to as a lights out kind of death, a sudden death?
Right. So what I observed from all of these videos is this was not a sudden death. Mr. Floyd did not, it's not like the snow shoveling where I told you somebody comes in, collapses and, clutches their chest and falls over. There was nothing sudden about his death. So that's what I would have expected if it was a cardiac arrhythmia or abnormal beating of the heart. Typically those are someone really falls over pretty quickly. And this was not that. Likewise, it was not the type of death that has been reported in fentanyl overdose, for example, where someone becomes very sleepy and then just sort of gradually, calmly, peacefully stops breathing. This was not that kind of a death. So I felt comfortable ruling out those as causes of death. And then on the flip side, I could clearly see from watching the video what happens to Mr. Floyd during this subdual restraint and compression, and what happens to his breathing is it gradually becomes more difficult and then stops.
Doctor, tell us, what is the bellows function?
Well, it's what your diaphragm does along with the muscles in between your ribs.
We've kind of already heard this. I'm at 43 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and end this. And if you guys want to go back and watch her, you can. I want to get to the cross where they cross-examine her, because that's where you get more. You get when somebody calls their witness, you get what they want you to hear. And then the cross will question them in a way that makes them justify what they said. So I want to hear what the cross has to say to her, not necessarily what she's saying now. I mean, she looks pretty good. She sounds good. Sounds pretty credible. The things she's saying make sense. And like I said, I'm okay with her so far. We'll see how she does on the defense.